Daesh's grip on parts of Syria and Iraq is shrinking. The terror group controlled vast tracts of land just 3 years ago, but its physical defeat appears imminent, with fighters held up in its last urban centre of Bukamal in Syria. The collapse of its self-proclaimed caliphate is on the horizon. The military pressure has been applied to Daesh on both sides of the Iraq-Syria border. Battlefield defeats of the terrorists are being hailed as a military victory by government, regime and coalition forces. But the threat the group poses remains high.
Our work is not done. As ISIS loses territory, they may seek to prove their relevance by stepping up terrorist attacks in the region and beyond, including here in Europe. So we must stay vigilant, we must stay engaged.
We must remain focused on the common threat, denying them their sick and twisted objectives. Groups like ISIS, groups that would seek to sow murder and mayhem, cannot be allowed to succeed.
The group thrived on the political instability and uncertainty in the region, and eliminating the source of the ideology which supported Daesh's growth in the first place is not clear-cut. The whereabouts of the group's leader, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, remains unknown. There is also no clear plan to claw back Daesh's digital presence, which it used to recruit individuals to follow its deadly mission in the so-called caliphate and overseas. And for now, there appears to be little in the way of de-radicalization programs in Iraq or Syria for former fighters and their families to reintegrate into mainstream society. The US Defense Secretary James Mattis says America's strategy is now to prevent the return of ISIS 2.0. But if ISIS 1.0 hasn't yet been fully defeated, is that plan premature? Natalie Pohanen, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from London, we have Murad Qureshi. He's the chairman of the Stop the War Coalition, a group dedicated to preventing and ending war. Also from London, we have Wael Aleji. He's the spokesman for the Syrian Network for Human Rights, a non-profit organization that documents human rights violations in Syria. Gentlemen, I thank you very much for joining us. Wael, let me begin with you. Is it over for Daesh? Is ISIS finished?
This is a battle of ideas. This is a battle of narratives. It cannot be won by military force only. So, yes, we could say that ISIS is being defeated militarily, but the battle in general is far from being won. And unless the international community engages actively and efficiently in the battle of narratives on the cognitive level, then another version, and most likely a more vicious version of ISIS will emerge 2, 3, 5 years down the road. So no, I don't think that the problem is finished now, simply because the roots that are giving rise for the problem still exist in Syria and in Iraq. Sunni Arabs, as long as Sunni Arabs continue to feel oppressed by sectarian regimes in Syria and Iraq, both regimes are supported by Iran, then ISIS and other extremist organizations will continue to find a fertile ground to recruit fighters and followers, and to spread their poisonous propaganda.
Okay, so Murad, do you agree with that? For as long as there is oppression, whether real or perceived, especially based on identity, and a well of hatred from which to draw from, then you can defeat Daesh on the battlefield, but this will continue.
Yeah. I don't disagree with that analysis, quite honestly. I also think we have to be aware of Daesh's presence in South Asia, in Afghanistan, for example. I do think that militarily has to be dealt with as much as what may be happening in the Middle East at this moment in time. And unfortunately, this ideology is going to be around, and in some ways the battle of ideals and ideas is a battleground in itself.
right.
which we shouldn't lose sight of, and one that affects us all and we can contribute to as well.
Yeah, Wael, let me ask you, in Syria, you guys have documented human rights abuses. The vast majority of the human rights abuses have come from the Assad regime via the barrel bombs and the mortars and so on. Tell me, how do you feel about the fact that some of the most egregious human rights violators, such as the Syrian regime, the Russians, Hezbollah, and if we take that further, the SDF, and if we go to Iraq, some sectarian militias, all of these groups can basically take the credit for defeating Daesh on the battlefield? Is it somewhat bittersweet for you?
Well, Syria, as you know, has become a place where regional and international powers are fighting for their interests. And of course, extremist organizations have taken advantage and infiltrated this environment. And I'm not talking only about ISIS and Al-Qaeda and other Salafi jihadist groups. I'm talking also about Hezbollah and the Shia militia coming from Iran, from Afghanistan, and they are equally terrorist and they are equally fascist. So yes, the Syrian regime and his backers, the Iranian and the Russians, namely, are responsible for the vast majority of human rights violations simply because they have more weapons, they have air force, they have heavy artillery, they have chemical weapons. So had ISIS and other organizations had such weaponry, heavy weaponry, so I would imagine that they would have used it against civilians. Yeah, yes, of course. So the fact that the Syrian regime is the biggest killer in Syria doesn't mean that ISIS and its likes are better than Assad's regime.
Murad, you and Wael both agree that the battle is won against Daesh, but maybe not the war, and a lot needs to be done in order to sort of put a lid on some of the root causes, right? You're against the war in general, but would you have to admit that it took a lot of warring to get to defeat Daesh on the battlefield? Because there was a time when it seemed as if they were going to swallow up large parts of Iraq and Syria. In fact, they did, and it seemed as if they were on the verge of taking over both countries. Would you accept that it took a lot of warring, it took a lot of fighting to actually get them to lose their land?
Yeah. What I would accept is that there is a geopolitical aspect to what we're seeing here in the Middle East, which has just been highlighted by the involvements of parties like the Russians. More recently, it's also taken a more sectarian nature. What we've got to look at is the circumstances that created that in the first place. And it's things like the Iraq intervention in 2001. It's also letting the genie of jihadism loose when we wanted the Mujahideen to attack the Soviet Union invasion of Afghanistan. The real difficulty we've got here is putting the genie back into the glass, and that's where I think a lot more. Well, that's a lot tougher than we appreciate. In some ways, military options are better understood, even in the complex setup of the Middle East, with rivalries coming to the fold between now Saudi Arabia and Iran. I do think a lot of responsibility has to be taken by creating the circumstances which have allowed the Al-Qaedas and Daeshs of the world to exploit.
Wael, what do you think of that?
Well, extremism is a very complex issue, and it is not possible to isolate one factor responsible for the rise of extremism. It's a multifactorial issue. You know, we can talk about poverty, we can talk about unemployment, we can talk about illiteracy, we can talk about oppression and dictatorship in the region, international intervention, foreign interventions, and obviously sectarianism and racism in Syria and Iraq. And as long as different or a particular ethnic or religious group continues to feel victimized and targeted by other groups, then there will always be a reason for certain people to go to the extreme. So unless we address the underlying issues in a comprehensive manner, then we are very unlikely to achieve anything in that respect.
Let's have a look at some of what had taken place in order to achieve the defeat of Daesh in a place like Raqqa. The BBC, Murad, uncovered a secret deal that led hundreds, maybe even thousands of Daesh fighters, including foreign militants, to evacuate Raqqa, to escape. This was under the gaze of the US-led coalition and SDF forces. They watched, they even helped facilitate. So it's worth remembering, these fighters and their families, they weren't there for a picnic in Raqqa. They were keeping Yazidi girls as sex slaves. They were stoning people to death. They were throwing gays off of buildings in Raqqa. They were let go. What does that tell you about the cynical nature of this war as it stands in November 2017, Murad?
Yeah. Well, I don't doubt this at all. And what was clear, though, there was a time, certainly in my lifetime, where you could have gone to Iraq and it was a fairly secular place, where human development was foremost in the minds of most people, and progress was being made. You may have issues with Mr. Saddam Hussein, and there were undoubtedly many. Yeah, but I mean, but he didn't allow
Murad,
a lot of this to happen.
Murad, he was putting political dissidents feet first into blenders, right? I mean, this man oppressed both the Shia majority and Kurdish minority and others to the ends of the earth, right? Yeah. I'm not asking the question to ask whether Saddam was better in the past. I'm asking about the cynicism of actually letting Daesh fighters go in order to achieve the greater goal of kicking them out of Raqqa. What do you make of that?
Well, it's an extraordinary story, and we need to hear it a lot more in the West. And it's the very nature, unfortunately, of conflicts that these kind of deals are done on the ground. People should realise that this isn't going to be a battle to the end, and that things like this are happening as ground is being captured again. I'm concerned about what's happening, particularly in Afghanistan at the moment, where the Americans have suggested that a few thousand increase of troops there is going to help them take control of Afghanistan, and that's where it all began 16 years ago.
Yep, fair point. Okay, Wael, is it a price worth paying to allow hundreds and maybe even thousands of Daesh fighters to leave if you can regain control over a city that they had controlled?
This is a very disturbing report, and I think that the UN should investigate this issue, and journalists should also investigate and explore this issue so we know what has actually happened in Raqqa. You know, this is a very dirty war, and traditional rules of engagement do not apply there, unfortunately. I wouldn't be surprised if dirty deals have been made behind the scenes. And if this was the case, then this should be investigated and exposed, because it shouldn't be allowed to happen that way, because we are talking about thousands of criminals who have committed the most horrible crimes. And if we are talking about international justice, if we are talking about human rights, then those who have committed crimes from all sides should face justice.
Right.
And this should be investigated by the UN. The UN should commission an independent body to investigate this issue.
Yep. Murad Qureshi, as we look at what comes next, you heard a few minutes ago in the preamble to the discussion, the NATO chief Jens Stoltenberg worried that even though you might oust Daesh from their territory, they might revert to asymmetric tactics, guerrilla tactics, their form of fighting or lashing out, which is terrorism in major cities across the world. Do you share those fears that now that they don't have any land, they're just going to keep on blowing up things using cars, using guns, using knives?
Yeah. I think we've seen evidence of that over the summer when they were losing ground militarily. They were lashing out, and I think clearly the events that we saw here on the streets of London in places like London Bridge, Westminster, Manchester Arena clearly indicated that there was a lashing out and instructing people wherever globally to terrorise people wherever that they lived and went about their normal lives. The critical thing is that this has been happening day in, day out, certainly in the Middle East, in Iraq, Syria, and the aspects of it are far more complex than meets the eye. A military defeat, I think, is more complex. Again, going back to Afghanistan, I understand the Americans are quite keen to do a deal with the Taliban, but people have suggested that there are elements within the Taliban which have absorbed Daesh quite actively and militarily. It's a very, very complex world out there, and we've got a further dimension of the increasing antagonism between Iran and Saudi Arabia, and who knows what opportunities that will give Daesh and others to operate in.
While what does it say about the Syrian war that we have one of the most egregious groups in history, in modern history, that is on the verge of being defeated, yet we're still not sure whether it actually means the war in Syria will be ending anytime soon?
The root problem in Syria wasn't ISIS, really. ISIS came after. The root problem is a sectarian regime that has been ruling Syria since 1970, ruling by terror and torture and blood and oppression and sectarianism and corruption. This is the real problem in Syria. And Assad's tactics and policies have given justifications and rise to groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda, because sectarian policies will always benefit extremist groups, because they will use it to fuel sectarian division and sectarian hatred, and invest in the sense of victimhood and sectarian grievances created by Assad's policies over decades. The conflict in Syria cannot be won militarily. Syria needs political reforms, a political solution that would bring real democratic changes to Syria. As long as there is sectarianism and dictatorship in Syria, then extremism will continue to flourish, and another form of ISIS will emerge in 2 or 3 years or 5 years.
While would you accept
because the circumstances are still there, the environment is still...
Certainly. You said as long as there's dictatorship, this will continue. Would you accept any political solution that includes the dictator in it?
Well, Assad is the main cause of the problem, and therefore I cannot see how a criminal person who used chemical weapons and ballistic missiles against his own people can be part of the solution. When we talk about a political solution, we talk about a solution that would bring real democratic changes, political reforms, and Assad cannot be part of this because he doesn't believe in democracy. He doesn't believe in human rights. He doesn't believe in equal citizenship. He is a brutal, bloodthirsty dictator. He cannot be part of such a democratic process.
So, Murat, isn't that a good case being made for why Assad has to go before anything gets better?
Well, look, I'm not here to defend Assad at all, but there's no doubt these conflicts have been extended and more complicated by external factors and the increasing emphasis on the sectarianism. The Alawites have been in control of Syria for yes, since the 70s, and they were never going to let go of the power at all. And you would have to have representatives of the Alawites there on the table when negotiating, hopefully and eventually, a political solution to all the issues in Syria that have presented ourselves over the years and in the present.
Okay, well, just as we sort of bring it all back to the beginning, Daesh on the verge of defeat. Soon after Al-Qaim in Iraq, they seem to be knocked out of Bukamal. They've lost their major cities in Mosul, major symbol, Raqqa. But bad ideas still live on, and their bad intentions in other places still continue. Syria's a mess. Iraq is not doing too well. It's depressing, gentlemen. I hope to have you on the program again in the not-too-distant future, Wael Aleji and Murad Qureshi. But for the moment, I've got to move on. Thank you very much for joining us on the Newsmakers.